welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Sara Keough is an Eco Nutritionist who began her career in ecological work in her home state of Colorado. She now practices full-time as a clinical nutritionist in Maryland. Sara supports patients with a wide variety of health conditions, including digestive issues, autoimmune disorders, heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. Educating patients on the value of nutrient-dense foods from local farmers is vitally important in her practice, as this is an essential component of the healing process for each and every patient. By utilizing advanced micronutrient testing and omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids testing for her patients, Sara is able to identify key nutrient deficiencies in order to get to the root cause of their conditions. Sara is passionate about connecting her patients to local farms to source their food, as she truly believes that regenerative farmers are the real healers of the planet and play a pivotal role in restoring human and ecological health. Sara Keough, what an honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. You've had some awesome guests on lately, and I'm just honored to be part of it.
You are absolutely very welcome. You will make a great guest. I'm so excited to talk to you. Unfortunately, I goofed something up. I've done this before. I did this to Dr. Brett Scher, who's a cardiologist. I made the mistake of walking down the cereal aisle about an hour before our appointment to do the interview, and I told him that as I was walking down the cereal aisle, I basically learned everything I needed to know about cardiology and what I should be eating, so we didn't really have anything to talk about. And I just went out and bought an Impossible Burger. And so now that we're able to make burgers out of plants or who knows what, I guess we don't really need cows and, animals on the planet anyway. So I don't know what we're going to talk about for now.
Yeah, you don't need to talk to me. I guess I'll just go back to my day. So.
How's the weather? It's so ridiculous. And I'm so excited to deep dive into this because it to me just blows my mind how we can convince people that these franken-foods, monster foods can actually be good for, us as humans and good for the planet. It must drive you absolutely bonkers.
Yes, it does. I thought it was just going to be one of these like fad type of diets that would just die out and go away. And it's just crazy how it's gaining momentum. So I'm really surprised.
Yeah, me too. I'm really excited to talk to you about this. First of all, can you tell us what an Eco Nutritionist is?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of this little title I dubbed to myself. Well, it's partially inspired by the amazing Fred Provenza, who you might be familiar with. He wrote the book Nourishment.
Yeah,
Are you familiar with Fred Provenza's book? Yeah. He just studied herbivore behavior, over decades as part of his research, and really got into the whole regenerative agriculture scene, of course. And we can definitely talk about some of his work and all the phytonutrients that they're finding in meat. And anyway, he said something in one of his talks about the doctors of the future will be ecological doctors. And he was more so referring to, regenerative farmers and ranchers that are kind of healing the land, with their regenerative practices. But since I had a background in, ecological work myself, I was, going into the field of conservation biology out in Colorado, where I'm from. And then I'm now in this field of nutrition. I thought, well, maybe I can be considered like an eco nutritionist. Once I saw everything, come full circle with really being part of the healthcare world and seeing how it's connecting now to regenerative agriculture and ecosystem health. It's really interesting how it's all so connected.
Yeah, that's so interesting. When I'm preparing for podcasts like this, I like to come up with kind of a list of questions I want to ask or things I'm curious about. And I found with this one, I'm kind of skipping around a little bit. Like I'll talk about, soil health, and then the next question is about nutrition, and the next one goes back to regenerative agriculture. And, I feel like it skips around a little bit, but I actually, thinking about it a little harder, like you really can't separate the two. You almost need to talk about them in the same, kind of context, don't you?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's something that I didn't learn anything about, in graduate school. And I feel like there should be a whole course on soil health and regenerative agriculture now, within anything that's any kind of healthcare degree. But they're definitely connected.
So when did you decide that this is what you wanted to do as far as the agriculture stuff? You said you were studying it. What made you so interested in it growing up?
Well, so, it's funny. I'd always been interested in farming. I was always one of those kids, that grew up in boring suburbia of Denver. and just wanted to be on a farm. I was jealous of kids that had the farm life because I just thought it always seemed so fun just to be able to grow your own food and raise animals. And I didn't know a lot about agriculture though. And in my work that I did with, conservation work, it was more just studying ecosystems and how they functioned and tracking, different wildlife populations. That's what one of the main things you do in conservation biology. You're trying to help preserve biodiversity. And it just gave me that background gave me a really profound appreciation for ecological systems. And like I said, how they function. And, when I got into the healthcare field, I was, I got my master's degree in nutrition around 2015 is when I finished with that degree. And then I was working in the DC area for a couple years. And, like a lot of big cities, DC is just a huge melting pot, right? A lot of diversity, a lot of different cultures. And I had a lot of foreign patients. And one thing that was very striking to me is they would say, what is wrong with the food in this country? They'd ask me, why doesn't the food have any flavor here, Sarah? It doesn't taste like anything back home. And, me just being, an American and not knowing anything else, I thought, what are you talking about? It has no flavor. And they say, yeah, the fruits, the vegetables, even the meat, sometimes it just doesn't have that flavor. And I thought, I have to look into this. It was a totally new thing for me. And it all went back to the soil and how we grow our food and how we even cultivate our food and store our food and process our food. But it all starts with the soil and how rich and healthy that soil is influences, the health of our food and how nutrient dense it is. And it's part of Fred's research too. Dr. Provenz's research is, this, what he calls like a flavor feedback mechanism, meaning that basically more nutrient dense food is going to have more flavor. And those flavors are kind of communicating to our body and telling us different things about the nutrition of that food. So, it all really started, I really got into the regenerative agriculture scene as a result of my clinical work and my patients.
Wow, that's so interesting. One of my favorite shows that I like to binge on Netflix is called Chef's Table. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that series.
Yes, I think I've seen only one episode though. It was a long time ago, so I need to get back into it. But yes,
Gotcha.
I heard a lot about it.
Yeah, no, it's really good, and it follows some of the best chefs in the world, the top Michelin star rated chefs in the world. And I want to say it was the second or third episode of the very first season. And I'm going to forget his name. I'm going to forget the name of the place, Blue Hill Farms or something up in New York. And the chef was trying to make the very best food that he could, and he learned that to make the best food, he needed the best ingredients, and that did come from the best soil. So before long, not only is he cooking food, but he's running a farm, and he learns that you need cows to kind of poop everywhere. So he's into cows. Then you need chickens to kind of spread the poop around. So now he's into chickens. And he needs to, have an animal that eats back the brush at the edge of the farm. And now he's into goats. And all of these things are making better foods. And one of the critics of the restaurant said, a carrot at this restaurant tastes more carrot than any carrot I've ever had. Like it just enhances all of the flavors. I just think that's so interesting. Just for the flavor of the foods is so much better when it comes from the right location.
Absolutely. And it's, I know who you're thinking of too. And I'm like, I know the farm and the name and I can't think of it right now either. It's going to come to us later. But there's another interesting little story too, that I have to tell. So I'm hearing this feedback, from patients and clients about our food lacking flavor. And I lived at the time with a friend who had a regenerative garden. Her whole front yard was this big regenerative garden. And I always thought she was kind of a food snob. She lived in France for 6 years and, knew food quality and, food is kind of revered, in certain European countries, right? It's like sacred. And so, she really just would give me a hard time for buying organic vegetables, at the store. And I want to bring this story up because I think a lot of people think that they're buying organic, quote unquote organic, and they think they're doing the right thing. And they are to some degree. They're sort of lowering their toxin load, right? Because organic food isn't grown with all the same pesticides and chemicals, as conventionally grown foods. But I just thought, why are you criticizing me for buying organic vegetables? And she's like, this stuff has no flavor, and it has no nutrition in it. It came from a giant organic, kind of factory farm, and they don't do anything to take care of their soil. And I had no idea what she was talking about. And I just thought she was being a total food snob. And she said, wait till you try, one day I brought home organic celery. And she's like, this has no flavor, And she said, wait till you try the celery from my garden. And I said, okay. So, season came around, and that celery was the most amazing celery I've ever tasted. It was just like, and it even looked different, they were smaller, and I was like, wow, I can't believe this is celery, and it was just, it like lights up your brain in a whole different way.
Wow. That sounds so good. We live just over the hill from where you grew up. So we're in Utah, and we here are really famous for tomatoes. And these tomatoes come in for like 2 or 3 months, and you get a taste what a warm, tomato that's been in the sun tastes like. And it is incredible. And you can't, that tomato does not exist right now. You can't find that anywhere because they're not in season. And the ones you get from the store are awful. They taste completely terrible. They taste like cardboard.
Absolutely.
It's amazing what the difference is.
Right. Now you have a lot of hydroponic stuff too that isn't even grown in soil at all. And that stuff really has no flavor to me.
Wow. This may be a good time to jump in and ask, what exactly is soil? I look around and see a lot of dirt in certain places, but how is that different from soil?
It's a very good question. And I'll give Gabe Brown a shout out. He has, he's a pretty famous regenerative farmer in North Dakota. So those of your listeners who may not be familiar, they might want to check out his book titled From Dirt to Soil. And he'll really dive deep into this concept and the transition he had to make on his farm. But in a nutshell, soil is thriving. It's full of life. And you can actually measure something called soil organic matter, which tells you a lot about, the healthfulness of your soil. Dirt is lifeless. It's just, it's usually when you see exposed soil anywhere, whether it's on a farm or in your yard, when it's not covered by any kind of vegetation, and it looks kind of dried out, that's dirt. But when you have vegetation on the ground, and you have living root systems, you have a lot of microbial life in that soil, and there's a lot going on in that soil. Carbon sequestration being one of the most amazing things. If you have soil life, they're actually pulling carbon down underground. So soil has the potential to be a huge carbon sink.
So when we're talking about problems with carbon in the air, we're talking about carbon sources, not carbon sinks, correct? We're releasing more of it than we're retaining?
Yeah. So carbon sink is, we're pulling carbon down out from the atmosphere into the ground, which is what you want. You don't want, obviously, we're trying to get some of this, the greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere, right? So we're trying to pull that carbon down underground. And, basically regenerative agriculture through restoring soil is showing that it can do that. And I know you talked to Nicolette, Nyman about this in your interview with her a few months ago, where she really explains this process really well and how the ruminant animals are involved in that process.
Yeah. She was great to have on. She has obviously done a lot of research, as have you. What lacks in a plant that's coming from, let's say, dirt versus one that's coming from a more rich soil? Is it actually the nutrients in the food?
Yeah, I mean, two major things I think of. Number one, lack of nutrients, so minerals, and also the microbial life. And I think actually the microbial life is more important. Those microbes become part of our own microbiome. And so if we are consuming foods that come from healthy soil, you're, number one, getting more nutrient dense foods. And number two, you're enriching your microbiome. Especially, when I'm out in my garden, especially if you don't wash things. And it sounds kind of funny, but yeah, eating dirty food can be a good thing. You wash off any soil so you don't have gritty food, but, you want some of those microbes to be remaining. You don't want to scrub your vegetables super clean. if they're coming from an organic source, and especially from your garden. So when I'm out in the garden, I'm just kind of like picking things out and just eating them. And this is what our ancestors did, right? They weren't taking things down necessarily to the river and washing them off before they ate them. They were just going along, hunting and gathering and foraging food, right? So we were getting all those microbes just as we were picking them from the ground.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is the role of diversity, correct? Where if we're trying to increase the microbes in our gut, the good microbes, we want the soil to be very diverse with lots of different life forms.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, lots of, diversity is key when it comes to different ecological systems, as far as having a healthy, robust, ecological system. You think of like a rainforest, right? Environments like a tundra or a desert are going to be a little more sensitive, a little more fragile when it comes to extreme changes, because they lack diversity compared to a system like a rainforest. So I often tell my clients that you really want to have a robust microbiome like a rainforest. You want to have this inner ecosystem, an inner rainforest inside you that's full of diversity, because that's just going to make it stronger and more resilient to change.
I really like that analogy. I might steal that. It's really good.
Your inner ecosystem. Nourish your inner ecosystem.
I love
your
it.
Your inner rainforest.
Inner rainforest. I love it. I hope there's no snakes in there. Okay, so let's go back a little bit. Tell us what the difference is between regenerative farming and maybe, more standard kind of farming, the way most people think about it today.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's there's almost like three big categories that I think of now. So there's conventional agriculture, which, really kind of took over more so, I guess, in the 60s and 70s. I learned a lot about that from Wendell Berry, who's one of my heroes. And he wrote the book, The Unsettling of America, that really described kind of like the unfortunate unraveling of small family farms. We were largely, a country of farmers, right? We had a huge farming population. And anyway, the conventional ag came on the scene, and this is when we more mechanized agriculture and started using agrochemicals. And that, of course, is destroying soil like crazy. It's just absolutely decimating our soil, turning it to dirt. And that's destroying a lot of our nutrient density in food. But even improper grazing practices, and obviously pulling animals off the land and putting them in a feedlot is the worst thing you can do, because animals are part of a well-functioning ecosystem in so many different ways. And so regenerative agriculture is really farming like nature. So, and farming with nature instead of against it. So conventional farming methods, again, using machinery and chemicals, are just fighting nature. And there's an in-between, which is organic agriculture. And I think organic is not quite regenerative, right? Organic is just, okay, we've stopped using chemicals, but they still might be using machinery and tilling the soil, which is really, really bad for the soil. And breaks up some of these fungal communities and microbial communities and actually releases carbon. So, again, these three big categories of conventional, organic, and regenerative. And obviously we want to go towards regenerative as much as possible.
I just read an article about organic farming and how sticky that can become. And people get into it with good intentions, but you could be lied to if you're outsourcing to a certain farm who may or may not be using chemicals, or if you're next to a farm that is not organic and, chemicals are flying off their plants or in the runoff of water. It gets to be really sticky. And I'm sure a lot of organic fruits and vegetables that we find at, the store, Whole Foods or whatever, we would test and probably find that they do have chemicals as well, right?
Sure. Yeah. I nothing's pure anymore. And even if you buy something with an organic label, it's going to have a lower, what I call toxic load, and it's going to be lower in pesticides. But there's even some loopholes that allow organic farmers to use certain pesticides, but it is limited, and it's not going to be as contaminated as conventional foods. But I don't know, it'd be really interesting to see some testing on that. I don't know if I've ever seen any research that really does look at the level of pesticides on conventional produce compared to organic produce. But yeah, there's going to be some contamination. And you think about the fact that there's, glyphosate now everywhere. And If you've listened to Dr. Zach Bush, and some of his talks, right, glyphosate, it's in the rain, they say, so he thinks it's just being rained down everywhere. And so everything's going to have some degree of contamination. Unfortunately, nothing's perfect, but if you do have a resilient system and you do have really robust, healthy microbial life in the soil, that can help to break down and degrade some of those chemicals, including glyphosate.
Interesting. One of my favorite documentaries, there's lots of really great documentaries that cover this topic, but one of my favorites is The Littlest Big Farm, I believe is what it's called. Or no, The Biggest Little Farm?
Biggest Little Farm.
Biggest Little Farm.
Yeah.
I always get the two mixed up.
I know, I do that too sometimes. I heard you reference that in your previous podcast interviews, and that has had a huge impact on me as well. I mean, how can you not cry, right, through that movie?
Every time.
It's beautifully done, and it really shows kind of like really everything, the plight, of small farmers and what they go through, but how rewarding it is at the same time, and the beauty of it all.
Yeah. I mean, they took this basically dead piece of land and transformed it into, such an amazing property with lots of soil and so much diversity. It was a lot of hard work, but they were able to do it. Is this really difficult for farmers to embrace?
It is. And to be totally fair and honest, some of the behind the scenes scoop with that film is they had a significant amount of funding, I guess, to make their transition. So it's gotten, a little bit of criticism at times at not being the most accurate representation of what small farmers really go through, because they don't have that funding. There's a lot of financial barriers to number one, even buying land, right? If you're a young farmer with not a lot of money, just to buy land and then to convert that land over into, a regenerative practice. So yeah, it's definitely, there's a lot of barriers. I think even if let's say you're also a large scale farmer with thousands and thousands of acres of corn and soy, it's a huge financial burden for them as well to make that conversion, from a conventional practice to regenerative practice. But it is being done. There's a lot of big hurdles to overcome. But what I hear time and time again, talking to so many regenerative farmers all throughout the world, but especially in this country, they say, I have the most rewarding life now. I actually enjoy what I'm doing. I'm not a slave to my farm, and nature's doing a lot of the work for me, and it feels like cheating. I'm more profitable, and and it just feels like it's just too easy. So getting over those hurdles is really a challenge in the beginning, but in the end, these farmers find that they're more profitable. And they're regenerative.
Wow, that's amazing. I love to hear that. That's so encouraging. You mentioned root systems, and you've talked about, things like corn and soy, which I believe are annual plants. Can you tell the difference in the root systems of annual plants versus perennial plants?
Yeah, definitely. So annual plants, they only have a lifespan of a year. So, most crops that you would plant in your garden would have to be planted. You put seeds in the ground year after year. And they're going to have, of course, a very shallow root system. Now, grasses are perennials. So when you hear about a farming operation being a perennial pasture, or they have perennials, they don't grow annuals, they have pasture land. And those are going to be very deep root systems, depending on how well, they take care of their pastures and how they manage the grazing of their animals. They can have incredibly extensive root systems. And that's just going to increase all of that soil organic matter, that's underground. And soil organic matter is composed of, living microbes and residues, of plant and animal matter. So that's where a lot of the magic happens underground. And that's where you get a lot of that carbon sequestration. So, the point is you do want a lot of perennials, on pasture.
And you mentioned managed grazing. What is that actually doing? I know it does a lot more things than just one thing, but what happens when we manage grazing properly and the right animals are allowed to go to the right areas? What all are they doing when they're there?
This is where I'm not an expert, but I always do my best to explain this. So there's several things that are going on with grazing that we need to think about. It's not just the animals are fertilizing the land, with their manure and with the urine, but they're also they're breaking up the soil in a way that's not like tilling. The action of their hooves into the soil kind of aerate it just gently. That's usually just enough to help, with the microbes underground. The other thing that I find really fascinating is that the tugging action of the animals, the ruminant animals, actually, eating the grasses, right? That tugging action is actually stimulating the plant to grow deeper roots. And it also stimulates the plant to secrete actually these different exudates into the ground, these different sugar compounds. And that is feeding the microbes underground. There's all these other interesting complex interactions too with the saliva from the animals and the microbes. And then there's a role there too that they play with one another. But so animals are doing all these important things. They're part of an ecosystem, right? And if you let the animals overgraze, and they graze everything too low, that's very detrimental to the plants. So managed grazing, especially like holistic managed grazing, is one of the terms that's used out there. That Alan Savory is pretty famous for. And Alan Savory has an amazing TED Talk that's been viewed over 1 million times. If you look it up, that's a must watch, where he really explains the importance of ruminant animals on the land. But yeah, it's all about observation. Making sure you watch your land. Usually got to move your animals daily. Maybe sometimes multiple times a day. You just it depends on how many, your stock density, meaning how much animals you have within a certain area. And you want them to sort of graze things evenly. And so it's about moving them around from different paddocks on the land and observing what's going on and their grazing practices, determining when to actually move them, when's the right time. You want them to graze to a certain level before you move them. Don't want to under or overgraze. So
you prefaced that answer with a warning that you weren't an expert in the topic. That was an amazing answer. I actually learned a lot. I didn't know about the pulling of the plant. That makes a lot of sense to me. That's super interesting. I was just reading another article that was talking about how we're losing the permafrost in Russia because temperatures are increasing, and it's exposing a lot of dead animals and dead plants from centuries and millennia ago, basically, which is also releasing a lot of carbon. And one of the only answers or solutions they had were to release a bunch of ruminant animals up there so they could eat some of the material and build up the topsoil that there is, and also compact the snow, which will make the air colder. It's just so interesting. Amazing. How like ruminant animals can solve so many of these problems and work with nature, like you said, rather than working against it. But the pushback we always hear that animals are bad for the environment and they're causing methane and all these greenhouse gases. How do you respond to that?
Oh man, I feel like people need to go back and listen to Nicolette's interview with you, because she did a beautiful job explaining it. But, essentially what I do for my clients, when I give webinars, I love pulling up infographics. And there's a really amazing infographic that was done on a life cycle assessment of greenhouse gas emissions from different types of meat production. And they looked at, maybe you've heard of this, they looked at Will Harris's ranch at White Oak Pastures down in Georgia, and he's a regenerative rancher. They also looked at Beyond's burgers and Impossible burgers and the greenhouse gas emissions from those two products, and conventional, feedlot beef. And it's just such a fascinating infographic, because you see there's greenhouse gas emissions from the conventional feedlot beef, Impossible burger, and Beyond burger. But there's actually carbon sequestration happening on the regenerative ranch at White Oak. And that picture is just, worth 1 million words. I mean, it's just, you look at that and it's like, oh my gosh, wow. Like this. And a life cycle assessment means that they're looking at total greenhouse gas emissions from beginning to end, how the food is grown, what's all involved in production, storage, transportation, everything, right? And you still have this negative carbon sequestration that happens, this negative carbon emissions that happens within the regenerative operations. I point people to movies like Kiss the Ground, in Diana Rogers' movie, Sacred Cow. And it really just does a good job, explaining that and giving people visuals about, this is when farming is done right, when ranching is done right, and we're doing it in the mirror of, nature, when we're mirroring nature and doing what nature, should be doing on its own on our farming operations, that's when you're doing something good for the environment. You're increasing biodiversity. There's the Audubon Society is involved with what's called conservation ranching. So this is on their website. A lot of these regenerative ranchers are now seeing bird populations come back to their land because of all the increase in biodiversity by adopting regenerative grazing practices, holistic managed grazing. So it's amazing all the things that we're seeing as far as how it benefits the planet. So yeah, and like I said, Nicolette did a great job explaining how greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture in general is a relatively small amount compared to other types of emissions. And of that total agricultural emissions, ruminant animals is a very small percentage, but yet they're getting blamed over and over for being like this source of greenhouse gas emissions, which is crazy.
It's so ridiculous. I really want to talk to you about Impossible Burgers. I think you might get a little fired up, which I love. Which I absolutely love. What is it? I've seen the ingredient list. I don't know what any of that stuff is. Do you know much about what these kind of fake meats are made out of?
Oh, definitely. I've written articles about this, and I've done a whole webinar on just breaking down like all the ingredients and highlighting every single one of them and explaining why they're unhealthy for us. So yeah, when it comes to the Impossible Burgers, the Impossible meats, and the Beyond Meats, those are the two that I always highlight because they're the most popular. But there's a lot of them now. In fact, a lot of the big meat companies are even making their own version of plant-based meats. But it's just processed food. It's all it is in a nutshell. It's just processed food. When you have the Impossible Burger, contains water, soy, protein concentrate, coconut oil, sunflower oil, natural flavors, potato protein, methyl cellulose, yeast extract, cultured dextrose, food starch modified, soy leg hemoglobin, on and on and on. Okay, just tons of ingredients on the label. And, again, in this 3-part series I wrote, it's called Artificial Animals. So if people Google my name and artificial animals or go on understandingag.com and look at their articles, I wrote a whole series on plant-based meats and again, why they're problematic for our health. And I break down every single ingredient and talk about the actual research behind it. Behind the problems that the health problems these ingredients can generate for people, but inflammation, gut issues, exacerbating autoimmune issues, causing immune system disorders is just a big focus of mine because I see so many autoimmune clients in my practice. So yeah, and talk about killing your microbiome. I mean, put these ingredients into your body, these hyper processed ingredients with all the chemicals that they're laden with, and that's just going to really impact your microbiome in a negative way.
That's so many human health issues. And then they always say that it's healthier for you to begin with, and it's healthier for the planet. But you're talking about all this processing. And I mean, that comes at an enormous cost in transportation. And, how do they access all these ingredients and what goes to waste? Like there must be such a process. It must be so much worse than it seems like having an animal alive for a few years that can feed maybe a family for 6 months.
Yeah, it's really infuriating that they can make any kind of health claims about their product and they have nothing to back it up. I mean, I would just love to debate Pat Brown, CEO of Impossible Foods. These people don't know anything about clinical work and working with a chronically ill patient. I would never, ever recommend these products to someone like that. And, even a healthy person, because this is just going to start creating issues later down the road for a lot of people if they really do consume foods like this, on a daily basis, if they make this like a staple food in their diet. But yeah, the environmental claims are ridiculous as well. We still know there's greenhouse gas emissions generated from the production of these products, and they're not doing anything to help soil? Nothing. They're derived. These ingredients are derived either from a lab, they're lab created, or the raw materials are coming from factory farm operations, monoculture factory farm, soy and corn operations that are not taking care of the soil at all. So yeah, the environmental and health claims are just ridiculous.
I like the way Brian Sanders from Food Lies thinks about this, to where there's some foods that are nutrient poor and they're like detractors. There's some foods that are maybe like neutral. They might not be as healthy as you think they are, but they're certainly not going to cause, most people tons of harm. And then there's foods that are, really great for you. And these are, like you mentioned, the most nutrient dense foods. What foods do you place at the very top, which are the most nutrient dense foods?
This is something I talk about in my presentations on nutrient density. And I always show this graph, which is just surprises everybody, but organ meats are by far the most nutrient dense. I mean, it was funny, growing up, I remember seeing books on superfoods. My mom always had these different, health and nutrition books. And superfoods were always vegetables or, some exotic thing that came from the rainforest or something, like acai berries, right, when they were all the rage. But no, it's organ meats that are incredibly nutrient dense, with minerals like zinc and copper and vitamin A. It's just one of the highest sources of vitamin A, which turns out is very important for our immune systems. And and children, and especially in third world nations, their growth and development is very, very dependent on key nutrients like vitamin A and zinc and iron and B12 and folate. And it turns out you only need just like 1 gram of ruminant liver to meet a third of the daily requirements for these children. And that was a nutrient dense study by Ty Bill. He's putting out some really good research on the nutrient density of meat. So liver, heart, all these organ meats are so nutrient dense, but even just ruminant meat itself. And I don't want to just make it all about ruminants. I mean, pork can actually be incredibly nutrient dense. If you have pasture raised pork, they offer some unique nutrients. They're omnivorous animals, so they have a different nutrient profile than ruminant animals. And, what's interesting too is these studies, they're still very, to me, what I kind of call surface level, meaning they're not really even getting that deep into some of the other amazing nutrients that we haven't well studied, like the phytonutrients that Fred Provenza talks about. So in a nutshell, an animal eating a very diverse diet, right, on a diverse pasture is getting all of these phytonutrients, antioxidants and, polyphenols and these alkaloid compounds and terpenes, all these other, secondary plant compounds are being incorporated into their fat and within their meat and their tissues, and we're consuming those. And that has a positive impact on our health too, our immune system and inflammation and all that. So yeah, I mean, those are definitely some of the nutrient dense foods I would put at the top of the list. That's not to dismiss vegetables by any means. They still rank pretty high up there, but organ meats are the king.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you mentioned acai. A new acai bowl place just opened right near me, and I've already seen advertisements like acai bowl is so good for your immunity and all these antioxidants. And you can, just from the pictures, you can tell this is a sugar bomb for sure. This has got to have 100 grams of sugar in it. It's pretty easy to tell, and yet it's claiming that it's so good for our immunity. Immunity is something that's super important these days. It's something you just mentioned as well. Tell us a little bit more about that and how animal foods contribute to immunity in that way.
Oh, definitely. I know it's one of those things. I think maybe folks aren't connecting, with their immune health, is that animal protein is very important for that. I mean, first off, in order to make antibodies, we need protein for that. Their proteins are the basis of antibodies, immunoglobulins. So we need plenty of protein. And there is some evidence that people with, autoimmune disorders actually need more protein than others. And on top of that, there's key nutrients so that we need for a healthy immune system. Everyone knows about zinc, of course, and vitamin D is extremely important, but vitamin A, these nutrients in particular help to heal the gut lining. So maybe your listeners have heard of leaky gut. In the medical community, we call that intestinal permeability. And that's basically where the lining within your gut has become sort of degraded and broken down. And then you have food particles and other things that leak, microbes and toxins that can leak into the bloodstream. And that can set off food sensitivities and inflammation, autoimmune disorders. So the gut is really, at root of the immune system, right? Which I know a lot of people realize now, and the microbiome itself plays a huge role in that. But just maintaining that, the integrity of that intestinal wall is crucial. And zinc and vitamin A and vitamin D and glutamine and amino acid glutamine all help to rebuild and protect that gut lining. Now, you can take those things as a supplement, and I do use them. I do use supplements in my practice, but by all means, I want people to get it from food as much as possible. And it turns out animal foods are the richest sources in those nutrients that I just named. Vitamin D, of course, we're supposed to get from the sun, right? And then that's all dependent on how much sun you actually get and what latitude you live at, and how well your liver and kidneys are working. So they still have to make that conversion with that metabolite that it's created, once the sun hits your skin. So vitamin D you're supposed to get from the sun, and really you don't derive a lot from diet. But the glutamine, the zinc, the vitamin A, B vitamins, they all are crucial for a well-functioning immune system and a healthy gut in general. So yeah, I steer people towards, more animal-based foods, because you're just not going to get those nutrients in significant quantities from any plant foods, really.
In your practice, how it's evolved over time, and as your learning has expanded, what kinds of things are you seeing in the people you see? Are you noticing that more people are getting better help now than they used to in the past? Were you able to help people using more conventional ways before, or is this something that's really transformed your coaching?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, because I think there's a huge interest right now in integrative, and functional medicine, right? There has been for years now, when people realize that they're not getting the help and support they need from the conventional medicine community. And that's not to say there isn't some great doctors out there within, practicing within the scope of the conventional medicine field. But within functional medicine, we're really trying to support the functioning of your body, quite simply. We're trying to get your body to work the way it's supposed to, the way it was designed to, and that's getting to the root of nutrient deficiencies. And so functional testing offers so many amazing insights and kind of helping me figure out everyone's individual puzzle. Everyone's like a puzzle to figure out, because we're all different individuals. So looking at micronutrient deficiencies, doing some stool testing and organic acid testing to see what's going on with the microbiome and what's going on with mitochondrial function. Food sensitivity testing can be useful just to see if there are certain foods that are kind of flaming your system that we need to maybe temporarily reduce until we do some more gut healing and get your immune system more balanced. And omega-3s and 6s. I mean, there's so much we can do within the functional medicine world to help get really to the root of what's going on, instead of the Band-Aid approach, right? That most people get from the conventional medicine field. And so, it's, especially over the last year or two, I feel like I'm getting people into my practice that are almost in a state of desperation. They're very sick. They're obviously tired of feeling the way they're feeling, and they're just not getting help, so they're looking for alternative approaches now.
What are some of the biggest hurdles or obstacles your patients face when they're trying to change their life?
Oh, it just depends. It really depends on the person. Obviously, for some people, it's financial hurdles, right? Food that's a better quality does cost more right now. So supplements are expensive. The testing is all expensive because it's unfortunately outside of the insurance system, right? Insurance just doesn't cover these things. So there's financial barriers for some people. And for some people, that maybe don't have the financial barriers, just change is hard. They find themselves often addicted to the sugar and carbohydrates, which I personally can relate to because I struggled with eating disorders including, binge eating and bulimia for, almost 20 years. And, sugar is highly, highly, highly addictive. So some people just from that standpoint have a hard time changing. You can give them all the directions and they can have all the money in the world and make all the changes so easily, but giving up the sugar and carbohydrate consumption for some of them is very hard, and helping to balance them in, their physiology is key. Getting their blood sugar regulated, working on the microbiome, plays a big role in that. So yeah, it just depends on the person. There's different hurdles to face, but that's part of the coaching that I do, is to work through those different barriers.
Can location be a barrier as well? Like if somebody lives in a city versus somebody lives in a more rural environment, is that a major obstacle that people have?
Yeah, maybe as far as access to food, like to good quality food, or just toxin exposure. I mean, being in being in a metropolitan area has its pros and cons, right? I mean, we have where I'm at here in Maryland. I'm in central Maryland. That's a slightly more rural-ish area. I live on a horse farm, but I only have to drive 20, 30 minutes to an awesome health food store, just to several health food stores. I have access to a lot of good food quality. At the same time, I'm surrounded by 3 major airports, international airports. So there's a lot of pollution in this area. There's a lot of traffic in this area. It creates a very stressful environment too, with all the fast-paced, lifestyle and traffic density and whatnot. So yeah, but food access is, when I think about rural areas, they have their struggles. I've spent a lot of time in rural areas, just traveling and spending time with farmers and speaking at different events. And, they have their hurdles to overcome too. I mean, you could be a regenerative farmer, but still, there's no good health food stores around. You're in a food desert, and you kind of really just have to rely on what you grow to be your nourishment. And I unfortunately do see a lot of farmers struggle. They have a lot of processed food in their diet because that's all they have access to, if they're not truly, growing everything they need, which is, difficult to do. So yeah, different challenges in each situation.
What are some of the baby steps you recommend for somebody that might have either of those obstacles? Maybe they can't afford, to spend very much on, food. And honestly, like if that's the case, you better not be driving like an expensive car, have a big house or something. I think that's a misprioritization of where you spend your money. But, somebody that it's a fair argument. They do live in the city, or they don't have the resources. What are some simple things that they can be thinking of? How can you get the most bang for the buck wherever they are?
That's where I feel like being really resourceful, and some of these companies that sell like the ugly produce. You've probably heard of that.
Yeah.
The produce that has maybe some little blemishes that doesn't sell well in the stores. You can buy it super cheap, through these services, and they do have organic options. Again, organic's not perfect, but if you don't have access to a regenerative farmer nearby, that's a good backup option, of course. And obviously growing your own food, just really encouraging people to start any type of little small garden that they can, even if it's just something on your back porch or balcony. There's little things that you can grow, and, focusing on the most nutrient dense foods. Organ meats are actually relatively cheap, compared to expensive cuts of meat. So organ meats can be very, you're getting lots of nutritional bang for your buck with organ meats. And you don't need to eat them every single day to get a lot of nutrient density, just, 3-4 servings a week. But that's one way, being just really, really smart with how you prepare your, animal-based foods. Like, for example, if you get a chicken, save that carcass, make bone broth. I make several batches of bone broth with just a chicken carcass and some chicken feet, to make that bone broth really gelatinous and full of collagen. You can use chicken feet, and that they're super cheap. So you got some really nutrient-dense bone broth. And, when it comes to produce, there's that clean 15 and dirty dozen list that maybe you've seen before, where it lists the 15 cleanest foods and and the dirty dozen. The dirty dozen, you should always buy organic. The ones that are, quote unquote, a little cleaner may not have as much pesticide, agrochemical, residues, and you can buy those maybe non-organic. So farmers markets, connecting with a local farmer, those are all ways to kind of cut out the middleman, which is the store. And, a lot of regenerative farmers sell direct to consumer. So you can purchase online, you can have things shipped to you. But if you can find someone local, all the better. And that, doesn't have to be, it's very expensive to buy direct from a farmer versus a store. So those were all little tips.
No, those are great. I love those tips. We do the chicken broth all the time. I need to figure out where I can get chicken feet because that sounds really good in there.
Yeah.
But you're right. Like a whole chicken is a few bucks. It cooks up really nice. You can prepare it many different ways and get a ton of really delicious meat. And then, yeah, you just save the carcass and all of a sudden you've got, several quarts of broth that's absolutely delicious. I think that's a great tip. You mentioned organic as a label, and I want to talk to you about labels and which ones really matter and which ones don't in the store, because I've heard you talk about this before, and I think sometimes they can be helpful, but other times they can be pretty misleading. Can you tell us which of the labels are absolute nonsense and which ones are actually important that we should pay attention to?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you're looking at, right? Because if you're looking at things like meat, okay, meat, we really want to find something that's 100% grass-fed. And I am starting to see things pop up that say regenerative, using regenerative grazing practices. And that's a little harder to find. But if you can at least find something that's 100% grass-fed, that's really key when it comes to omnivorous animals, especially chicken. Chicken is one of the proteins I eat the least, just because it is most of the chicken that you get in the market or even at a restaurant, it's going to come from a factory farm, probably about 99% of the time, sadly. And that's where they're feeding them a lot of corn and soy. If you see something that says vegetarian fed for an animal that should be an omnivore, that's what you don't want, because they're not vegetarians. They're supposed to be on the pasture. They eat bugs. They will sometimes even eat small rodents. I mean, they're little dinosaurs, or like these little raptors, right? That's where they think birds came from.
Yeah,
is
right.
the little dinosaur lineage. So they're omnivores. They eat all sorts of things. So they shouldn't be eating just corn and soy. So you want, a really nutrient dense pasture raised poultry. Same thing with pork, should be pasture raised. But that's where connecting with the farmers really important who grew your food, because it's hard to trust labels at the end of the day. I do try to get things that are organic as much as possible as far as packaged goods. If there's little treats and things that I get here and there, maybe little cookies and stuff like that, I try to go for something that's like organic and, some little organic paleo cookie or whatnot. But for the most part, ingredients are what people really need to pay the most attention to. If they're looking at a label that lists ingredients, don't get hung up on the nutrition facts or the fact that it's, just organic. Really look at what that food is made out of. Does it have a huge, long ingredient list and things that you can't pronounce, right? They say if you see a lot of chemicals and natural flavors, and that's what I want people to pay attention to more than anything when it comes to packaged foods is the ingredients versus just the nutrition facts. But it's a little harder with the animal foods, but I have a guide, that I usually get to my patients that kind of helps them navigate that when they're in the store and what to really look for.
Oh, nice. Yeah, you mentioned chickens. I also find that the labeling around eggs is somewhat weird, right? Like, isn't it like cage-free doesn't mean anything really? And like some of those terms, have some weight and some don't. And you really should always go for the pasture-raised, eggs that came from pasture-raised chickens.
Yeah, and here's the thing with that to just be mindful of, and thank you, I knew I was forgetting something with eggs. Yes, that's something I list out in my little guide, ignore the cage-free, free-range stuff. It truly doesn't mean anything. And sadly, sometimes pasture-raised, how much access did they really have to pasture? We don't really know. But, soy, really should try to look for soy-free pasture-raised. I try to avoid chickens that were fed soy. There's a little bit of evidence that indicates soy in a chicken's diet can really raise their omega-6s, which can create more inflammation in the body if we have too many omega-6s and not enough omega-3s. So yeah, soy-free pasture-raised chicken is what I'm starting to see pop up in a few, health food stores. But it can sound like splitting hairs, right? When we're really getting into the nitty gritty of what these animals are eating, but it matters big time.
Mm. It's so interesting. My wife and I were driving down the street the other day, and we see the fast food joint on one corner and, double lines wrapping around the building. And we look across the street and there's a soda store. Same thing. The line is wrapping around the building. And these places are getting more and more popular. I look around at the population. They sure don't look like they're going in the right direction, unfortunately. And, sometimes it's really hard to be optimistic that we're heading in the right direction. So I want to ask you, what makes you feel the most optimistic about what you do and the message you share with people? When do you think that gives you the most hope?
Well, I see a growing interest, I think, in a little bit in agriculture, but just in health in general. I feel like people, especially over the last couple of years with what we faced with the pandemic, right? I think people are really taking their health a lot more seriously. I do think there's a high stress level at the moment, right? There's a little bit of, at least some low grade anxiety for the majority of us, if not significant anxiety, sadly. So I think that's where some of those choices are coming in, where they're turning, people are turning to fast food and some quick, easy meals. So yeah, it can seem kind of discouraging on the surface where we see some of those things. But I do see a lot of people waking up, and I think that's really promising. You kind of just have to connect with a tribe, right, of like-minded people and keep growing that as much as possible. Whether it's just a little local community of people in your neighborhood or online, whatever it may be, just having a people that keep you going and encourage you, and trying to influence other people to, hey, watch this movie, watch this documentary, or read this article, and get people involved in the movement of supporting regenerative agriculture. I feel like I'm seeing the word regenerative agriculture being thrown around a lot, which can be kind of concerning because you hope it doesn't get kind of watered down and lose its true meaning, but doesn't just become a buzzword. But it is good that I'm seeing that, okay, people are talking about regenerative agriculture. People are interested in regenerative agriculture and what it means. And Kiss the Ground, I think, got a lot of attention. And have you seen Kiss the Ground?
I have. It's so interesting because it promotes, regenerative agriculture, but one of the main producers is actually a vegan, which I totally respect. Yeah. Really amazing.
Yeah. And so is, and David Bronner's too, who does Bronner's soaps and all that stuff. He's vegan, and I haven't personally met him, but I've heard from friends that he's just like one of the coolest vegans because he's so open-minded. He's not out to bash animal agriculture and destroy animal agriculture. He's fully supportive of regenerative grazing practices. The Rodale, I think it was the Rodale Institute, was trying to come out with this regenerative organic certification, which this is where labels can get really tricky in these whole certification processes, because that is one of the barriers for farmers. Sometimes they just can't afford, these certifications, despite that they might be doing things in an organic and regenerative manner. But Bronner's, David Bronner's he has that regenerative organic label on some of his products. I think he has regenerative organic chocolate and coconut oil, and so there's the market for that is slowly growing, I feel like, and that's promising to see that there's an interest.
Yeah, that's great. That is promising, at least on a small scale, but that's where change has to happen, right? It's at the individual level. Yep. So we'll keep sharing the message and moving it along. This has been an amazing conversation. What is one simple tip you would like to leave for somebody who wants to pursue this and wants to eat healthier than they are currently?
Someone who wants to pursue this whole path of, I think, just becoming a regenitarian, eating more regenerative diet, start with maybe some documentaries. Again, I Kiss the Ground. I can't say enough about what an amazing film that is. And Sacred Cow is another great documentary. If you really want to get into a lot of the heavy duty science of it, Fred Provenza's book, Nourishment, is absolutely amazing. Understanding Ag, their website, if you go to understandingag.com, Gabe Brown, Ray Archuleta, Alan Williams, kind of helps create that organization to, teach really farmers to convert to regenerative practices. And the most important thing you could do is just find a local farmer. And maybe they may not be perfectly regenerative, but maybe you can even enlighten them to some regenerative practices and talk to them about their soil. A farmer that's really excited to talk about their soil is always a good sign. And that's someone that is really paying attention and really looking at their farm like an ecosystem and valuing the health of their soil. So even if they don't call themselves quote unquote regenerative, find a local farmer. Regeneration International is a great resource too. They have a really cool map. Go on their website and pop in your zip code, and you can find a regenerative farmer nearby. And that's what it's all about. Support our farmers. They really are our healers, healing the land and healing people.
That's amazing. So cool. So many great tips from this conversation. Sara Keough, where should we send people who want to connect with you and your work?
They can email me at Sara without an H. So SARA at eco-nutrition.com.
Awesome. We will link to that in the show notes. Sara Keough, thank you so much for all of the consideration that you have put into your career, for learning so much about regenerative agriculture and also about nutrition, how those two things are so interrelated, and being willing to share your message as well. I'm hearing you on different podcasts, and you appearing here today, I think, is a great way to spread the message. And so we're so grateful for you and for your work. And thank you for being hosted on our show today. We really appreciate you.
Thank you, Casey. I just appreciate the opportunity to share this with your listeners and to support our regenerative community. So thank you for all you do.
Absolutely. It was such an honor. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.